Exodus chapters 1 and 2. And I'm going to start here with this question. What is the Bible about? What is the Bible about? If you remember, back in 2021, we did this thing called the story, right? That took us through the entire Bible, kind of give us this big overview of what the Bible is about. And I borrowed the Bible Project's kind of little thought of their purpose statement. That's what it is. Their purpose statement that the Bible is one unified story that points to Jesus. And why does it point to Jesus? Because Jesus is God's way of redeeming, restoring, rescuing his good creation. So really the Bible is about God restoring, rescuing, redeeming his creation. And that starts with people. Because if we remember back that God created men and women in his image to rule alongside of him, to be good stewards of this good creation that he has made. And so if God is going to rescue and redeem his good creation, then he also has to redeem and rescue humanity. The two go together. And so as we look at the Bible, the first book of the Bible is Genesis, the beginning, right? And chapters 1 and 2 tell about God's creation, how God brings order out of chaos. This good creation with the crowning moment of humanity, which he calls very good. Chapters 3 through 11 talk about humanity's rebellion and the corruption of this good creation. And so you have, starting with Cain, well, actually starting with Adam and Eve and the eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And then you have Cain. And you have all these descendants of Cain who are doing evil and murdering and killing. And you have the flood. And then even after the flood, you have all this dysfunction and corruption leading up to chapter 11 and the Tower of Babel, how these people are going to create this city, this tower, to defy God, to make a name for themselves. And then with chapters 12 through 50, the rest of it, you see that God puts his plan in redeeming creation into action by calling one man, Abram, later to be named Abraham. And the rest of the book of Genesis follows Abraham and his descendants, really focusing on this character named Joseph, who goes to Egypt as a slave, who God blesses, who becomes second in command in Egypt to rescue Egypt and his family from famine. And his family moves to Egypt, where they stay, and in this place they are multiplied. They grow into a nation. God blesses them there. And so that leads us to the second book of the Bible, which is Exodus. And this book becomes the model of how God rescues his people, restores relationship with them, and imagines the great hope for the future. So when we talk about rescue, when we talk about redemption, in the Bible, it all goes back to Exodus. Exodus becomes the archetype of what God's redemption and rescue look like. To the point that when we get to the New Testament and the Gospels, when does Jesus' crucifixion happen? Around what holiday? What festival? Passover, which is the central story of Exodus. It's connected back to Exodus. So even understanding so much of the New Testament comes from understanding this book of Exodus. But Exodus is more than just a book about deliverance. It is also about it's also about the story of how God comes to dwell with his people. This is the other part of the Bible that sometimes we forget. That God desires to dwell with his people. It's not just about saving us from our sins, but it is about God dwelling with us. And so in the New Testament, right, we see God sending his Spirit, the Holy Spirit, to be with us, to dwell with us. And then Revelation ends with heaven and earth coming and joining together, and God will be with his people. God desires to dwell with his people. And we see that in Exodus as God gives them a covenant and as God tells them and gives them instructions on how to build this thing called a tabernacle, and his presence coming to fulfill it. Right? And so in Exodus, we see that God leads his people by a pillar of fire during the day and a cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night. Right? God is with his people. God dwells with his people. So the ideas and the images of Exodus show up all over the New Testament, so it is a book worth studying. Exodus reveals the God who saves his people, binds them to himself, and dwells among them. So I've broken up this sermon series, and I've broken up the reading plan into 3 acts. Act 1 is chapters 1 through 15. God delivers. Act 2 is chapters 16 through 34. God covenants. And Acts 3 is God, which is chapters 35 through 40, God dwells. What I want us to remember from this sermon series, our big idea for the series, is God is faithful to his people. God is faithful to his people. No matter what, God takes the initiative to save, to rescue. He keeps his promises. So, Genesis. So here's the background as we get into Exodus. Genesis chapters 37 through 50 mainly focuses on a man named Joseph. He's the favorite son of his father Jacob, also known as Israel. Joseph is sold into slavery, goes to Egypt, but there in Egypt, God empowers him to save both Egypt and his family during a worldwide famine. And that is why the descendants of Abraham are in Egypt rather than in the promised land when Exodus begins. So let's start here with Exodus chapter 1, verses 1 through 14. These are the names of the sons of Israel, that is Jacob, who moved to Egypt with their father, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. In all, Jacob had 70 descendants in Egypt, including Joseph, who was already there. In time, Joseph and all his brothers died, ending that generation. But their descendants, the Israelites, had many children and grandchildren. In fact, they multiplied so greatly that they became extremely powerful and filled the land. Eventually, a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. He said to his people, "Look, the people of Israel now outnumber us and are stronger than we are. We must make a plan to keep them from growing even more. If we don't, and if war breaks out, they will join our enemies and fight against us. Then they will escape from the country." So the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses as supply centers for the king. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields. They were ruthless in all their demands. So here we see that God is faithful. And in this story, it might be hard to see how God is faithful because we see Egypt, headed by Pharaoh, oppressing them and bringing them into slavery. So how is God faithful to Israel in this moment? Well, we have to remember Genesis. We have to remember that when God created men and women, he said to them, be fruitful and multiply. We have to remember back in Genesis chapter 12, when God calls Abraham, he says, I'm going to make you a great nation. And then other times when he reaffirms that covenant, he says, I'm going to make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky. So God is keeping his covenant. He is being faithful to Israel because they are multiplying, because they're becoming a strong nation, to the point, right, where Pharaoh gets scared because of their strength, because of their numbers. The other thing that we have to see here is that Pharaoh, who is not named, so that makes it hard for us to know when the Exodus actually happened. So we don't know what Pharaoh was in power when all this takes place. But Pharaoh, in that culture, is the image of God. He is the representative of God. And a lot of times these pharaohs would be given divine status. And so part of when we come to the book of Exodus, what we want to see is that we have God, the creator God of the universe, keeping his promise, being faithful, and being opposed by the gods of this world, the little gods, represented by Pharaoh. And so God is there to bless, to multiply, to give life, and Pharaoh is there, and what does he do? He opposes God. He takes away life. He says, we need to fear them. And humans, right, Israel as God's people, are to work for the glory of God, but Pharaoh puts them to work for the glory of him and build these cities, which should remind us back to Genesis with the Tower of Babel. We're going to build this city. We're going to build this tower to make a name for ourselves. So rather than Israel working for the glory of God, Pharaoh puts them to work for the glory of him. And this kind of sets up the conflict that we are to see in Exodus. So God is faithful because he is blessing Israel, and Pharaoh is opposing God by making Israel's life hard to try to keep them from multiplying. So the first step in trying to diminish the number of Israelites is we're going to make them hard, we're going to make them work hard, we're going to make their lives miserable. That is what we are going to do. But God blesses them with children and with the means to make families, with the food, the clothing, the resources that they need. And what this tells us, and it's important for us to remember, is that God's faithfulness is not just the big acts of deliverance. God's faithfulness is usually seen in the small, everyday blessings that allow us to live as his people in a world that is opposed to him. Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 through 22. Then Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, gave this order to the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. When you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. But because the midwives feared God, they refused to obey the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live too. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives. Why have you done this, he demanded. Why have you allowed the boys to live? The Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, the midwives replied. They are more vigorous and have their babies so quickly that we cannot get there in time. So God was good to the midwives, and the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile River, but you may let the girls live. So the main covenant blessing continues to be children, and God gives life, right? So God is continuing to bless Israel. So Pharaoh says, well, this plan of oppressing the Israelites to make their lives so harsh and unbearable to keep them from having kids, this isn't working, so we need to step it up a notch. So he gets these midwives, and there's probably more than just two. The Bible just mentions two, but if we're assuming that that Israel is numbering in the thousands, maybe up to 1 million people, they're going to need just more than two midwives to take care of all of this, because the midwives are involved in every part of the delivery process, from conception to taking care of the mother during her pregnancy and to delivery. They're the whole time. And so they're going to need more than two, but they're representative of these two. And Pharaoh says, okay, when you go and you deliver these babies, I want you to kill the boys and let the girls live. So Pharaoh's main concern is that he doesn't want Israel to have a strong army, so kill the boys. But he's going to let the girls live because he still needs a workforce. And so the girls are going to become wives to other slave populations so that they can have this workforce, but Israel will be wiped out. Israel won't have a name anymore. That's the plan. But these midwives fear God more than they fear Pharaoh, and so they let the boys live. And they come up with this excuse like, hey, these Hebrew women, they're stronger, more vigorous than you weak little Egyptians. Like they give birth before we even get there. Which there is some evidence that is true, that some Semitic people did that over compared to the Egyptians. So they may not have really been lying. That might really been a true statement. But it gave them a reason to say, hey, this is why we aren't following along with your order. And because they feared God, they were faithful to God more than to Pharaoh, God blesses them. So God continues to bless Israel. He continues to multiply them. He continues to remember his faithfulness to them, to the point where Pharaoh says, okay, my opposition to Israel, my plan to destroy Israel, to wipe them out, is not working. And so now I'm going to involve everyone. If you see a Hebrew boy, you're to throw them into the Nile to kill them. And so remember, the Nile River is of supreme importance to Egypt. It is both the life giver and the life taker. So it's not unusual for executions to happen by throwing them into the river, either for drowning or to be fed to the crocodiles. Like that. So that is what's happening. Like, this is how we're going to take care of this problem. This is how we're going to take care of this problem. And yet God continues to bless them. Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. 1 through 10, that's right, yeah. About this time, a man and a woman from the tribe of Levi got married. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby and kept him hidden for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and went and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. The baby's sister then stood at a distance, watching to see what would happen to him. Soon Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, and her attendants walked along the riverbank. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it for her. When the princess opened it, she saw the baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then the baby's sister approached the princess. "Should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" she asked. "Yes, do," the princess replied. So the girl went and called the baby's mother. "Take this baby and nurse him for me," the princess told the baby's mother. "I will pay you for your help." So the woman took her baby home and nursed him. Later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, "I lifted him out of the water." So after 400 years, as Israel is being oppressed, as Israel's being enslaved, God finally gives the deliverer. But remember here, we have the benefit of looking back and see, oh, God is at work. But what does the rest of Israel know about what God is doing at this point? They don't know anything about Moses. They don't know anything that God is doing. And so it doesn't make any difference that this little baby is born. The Israelites are still enslaved. They're still oppressed. But in the midst of all of this, God provides a way for the deliverer to be protected. Not just protected, but prepared. Here's something to keep in mind. Because oftentimes, what we will say is that our circumstances are preparing us for the mission that God has for us. But that is not always true. It's true in the case of Moses. But for the rest of the Israelites, their circumstances was not preparing them for some grand mission that God had for them. Oftentimes, what God expects from us in our times of hardship, in our times of oppression, in our time, is not this thought of, oh, God is preparing me for something greater. It is, I need to be faithful in this moment. I need to be faithful in the moment. And the reason why that matters, because I think sometimes we get distracted because we're wondering, well, what is God teaching me in this? What is God's purpose for me in this? And what happens is that we miss what God is actually doing. But if our purpose in our hardships, if our purpose in our situations, if our purpose in our circumstances becomes, how do I remain faithful in this moment? Then God is going to use those moments for his purposes, whether that's for some grand mission later on or not. Our job is to be faithful no matter what happens to us. But in Moses' case, because God had set him apart for this special purpose, God is setting him up to be prepared. And so you have Pharaoh's daughter come down to the Nile River to bathe. Now, we don't know this for sure, but it's an interesting thought. So by the time of the Exodus, whether you go with the early date or the late date, it doesn't matter. Egypt already had indoor plumbing. She doesn't have to go down to the Nile River to bathe. But given the fact that the Nile River was seen as a god or a goddess, as the life giver, it's very likely that she's going down there to finish some religious ritual. And it could be very plausible that she is going down to bathe after doing some fertility ritual. Like she is waiting for a child. She can't get pregnant. And so she's done this ritual. And she goes down to the Nile to bathe. And what does she find? A baby. And even though she recognizes the baby as a Hebrew, right? She says that. It could very likely be like, hey, this is one of the boys that was thrown into the river, but the Nile saved it for me. This is my child. And we see that by his name. So the Hebrew kind of version of the name, the writer says, means to draw out. But in Egyptian, Moses is a very common kind of part of a name, which means the child of or born to. So for instance, Ramses, who we often connect with the Exodus, means born of Ra, or the child of Ra. So Moses and Ramses are connected names. But what does Moses mean? Born of. Child of. Child of who? Born of who? We don't know. And really that helps us to see what's going to happen with Moses. Like he's going to struggle with his identity. Like, who am I? Where do I come from? But this allows Moses to be his formative years spent with his mother, with his family, learning what it means to be a Hebrew, an Israelite. He goes to the palace where, if you're reading Stephen's address in the book of Acts, he learns all about what it means to be an Egyptian. It was common for those in the palace to learn military tactics and to learn law and governance. And so Moses is learning all those types of things. He's being prepared. He's being prepared for what God has for him. Exodus chapter 2, verses 11 through 25. Many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. "Why are you beating up your friend?" Moses said to the one who had started the fight. The man replied, "Who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me as you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" Then Moses was afraid, thinking everyone knows what I did. And sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. When Moses arrived in Midian, he sat down beside a well. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters who came as usual to draw water and fill the water troughs for their father's flocks. But some other shepherds came and chased them away. So Moses jumped up and rescued the girls from the shepherds. Then he drew water for their flocks. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why are you back so soon today?" "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds," they answered. And then he drew water for us and watered our flocks. "Then where is he?" their father asked. "Why did you leave him there? Invite him to come and eat with us." Moses accepted the invitation. He settled there with them. In time, Reuel gave Moses his daughter Zipporah to be his wife. Later she gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, for he explained, "I have been a foreigner in a foreign land." Years passed, and the king of Egypt died, but the Israelites continued to groan under their burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked down on his people of Israel and knew it was time to act. So, here we see Moses had an understanding of his heritage, that he was a Hebrew. He wanted to identify with them. He was also given this spirit of justice. And so he's out there and he sees this Egyptian treating a Hebrew unfairly, unjustly, and he looks around, he kills the Egyptian. Which sometimes I think we want to say, hey, that was a justified killing, but God doesn't see it that way. Moses is acting not with God's direction. He's kind of taking matters into his own hands. And so the next day he's back out there. He sees two Israelites fighting, and he tries to break it up. And one says to him, hey, who made you judge, ruler over us? Well, God will in time, but not yet. And then Moses becomes afraid. He thinks that, hey, people are going to find out, and Pharaoh does, tries to kill him. He runs off to Midian. Now, we have to remember, Midian is a descendant of Abraham too, from his second wife after Sarah died. And Reuel here is called a priest. So it's thought that there is some echoes or some connection to the Creator God, to the God of Abraham, that carries on through Midian. So part of what I think God is doing is God sends Moses out into the wilderness to Midian to learn more about who he is from this priest, Reuel, but also to learn how to be a shepherd, to learn some humility. And there he is. We see his sense of justice rise up again when he saves the girls from these shepherds. So he's carrying this sense of spirit, this spirit of justice in his life as well. But he still doesn't know who he is. It has reflected in the name of his firstborn son, Gershom. I'm a foreigner in a foreign land. Who am I? Who am I? That's who he's trying to figure out. And here the book, this chapter ends by saying, hey, the Israelites cry out to God, and God hears their groans, and he remembers his covenant promises, and he realizes now is the time to act. And we can be thinking, well, is God not acting? Is God, what is this about? Because as we've just noticed throughout these first two chapters, is that God has remembered his covenant. He has been faithful. He has multiplied them. They have become a nation. But I think what happens is that God has been working slowly over these 430, 440 years or whatever to set the stage for what is about to happen, to have this dramatic conflict between the Creator God and the gods of this world, so that everyone will know who really is in control. And now the stage is set. Now we know what is going on. But I think it's also important for us to remember here that even in oppression, God is at work. That God is at work in blessing us in many different ways. But we need to keep in mind that God is not obligated to treat us in some fashion, in some way. If we feel like God is obligated to save us, to heal us, to provide for us, because we do A, B, C, or D, then we're going to miss out on what God is up to. God is not obligated to do that. But God is going to keep his faith, keep his covenant. He's going to be faithful to his people, and he's going to bless us. And so we need to keep our eyes open to what God is doing in our lives. So as we can do what the old hymn says, we can count our blessings and name them one by one. Because ultimately, our hope is not that God will rescue us out of this particular hardship. Our hope is that God will bring us to his city in the future where we can dwell with him. So what do we do when God feels silent? In January of 2001, my Uncle Tim, who at the time was the basketball coach for Dubuque Senior High School, was battling cancer, melanoma, which had also become a brain tumor. And we were praying and praying and praying. I remember my dad visiting Uncle Tim and telling us later that he's never seen anybody pray harder over a bowl of Jell-O than what Uncle Tim did. And I know my prayer, as I was a youth pastor in Stronghurst, Illinois at the time, my prayer was that God would bring a miracle, that with this position that Uncle Tim had as basketball coach in Dubuque, like, hey, not only would these students at senior high, but this whole community would see this miracle and have this opportunity to know who God is. And yet, it didn't happen. From his diagnosis in October, by February of 2001, Uncle Tim had died. Despite all of our prayers, despite of all of our hope that he would answer. And at that same time, a week after my Uncle Tim died, my Grandpa Steele died. And if I remember right, it was either the same day as Uncle Tim died or the same day that my grandpa died. My grandma also had a brother die. And she got up at church that next Sunday during prayer request time. And she said, I want to thank God for heaven. Yeah, our prayers were not answered by a miracle. There was no great Exodus story for us. But my grandma had her sight on what really mattered. It wasn't the escape from what was causing pain and hardship in that moment. It is the belief in a good God who one day will make everything right and dwell with his people. And we thank God for heaven. And that is where our faith, that is where our hope needs to be. So when God feels like he's silent, we need to take a step back and look at how God is working in our lives right now to bless us, to empower us, so that we can be equipped to do this work of making disciples, of loving our neighbor right where we're at, and keep our minds and our focus on what our hope is, on this heavenly city that God has promised to all of us. And God has promised to all of us. So our big idea this morning is this. God is at work for his people even when he seems silent. God is at work for his people even when he seems silent. Even in 400 years of slavery, God is at work. Even in our hardest, most difficult moments, God is at work. And we may not always see it, we may not always understand it, but as people who follow Jesus, we have to believe it. Because God is a good God who loves his people and has made a way for us to experience salvation. So here's our challenge this week: to be faithful where God has placed you. Whether or not rescue comes, be faithful. Fear God more than Pharaoh. Look for God's blessings in the midst of hardship. Trust that God is working even when you don't see deliverance. Stay obedient, stay courageous, stay faithful. You may not be Moses. You may not be the deliverer, but you may be Sephora. You may be Puah, those two midwives who had more courage than all the men there in Israel put together. Be faithful. God is at work, and he remembers his covenant. Silence does not mean absence. Waiting does not mean forgotten. And faithfulness is never wasted in the hands of a faithful God. The same God who is working quietly in Exodus 1 is the God who acts powerfully in Exodus chapter 14. And he is the same God that we serve today.